My purpose today is to help us to think Christianly about acts of discrimination using the United States experiment to evaluate these kinds of things and to look at proposed legal remedies to them. I'm going to give you three perspectives. First, I want us to understand the important theological foundations. Second, I want to show how those foundations should inform justice and thereby shape the law and the public square. And thirdly, I want to assess some efforts showing that in many cases in the United States, despite good intentions with so-called non-discrimination laws, they create great wrongs. Greetings to everyone. You are some of my favorite people, and it's my great privilege to again having the opportunity to be able to address those in the Republic of South Korea, particularly on behalf of the Alliance for Gospel Advocacy. My task today is to address discrimination, disagreement, and dissent, and to particularly focus on when good intentions produce great wrongs. Modern society still reflects ugly conduct, and this is certainly true in the United States. A friend of mine, for example, his daughter is half Asian, and upon returning to school after a COVID quarantine, she's insulted and bullied for having spread the, quote, Wuhan pandemic. She's not Chinese. She's half Japanese. I have Korean friends that have had the same insults hurled at them during this COVID time. And then, of course, unique to the United States is the experience of black American men who are statistically subject to more frequent police stops, more frequent questioning, and sometimes abuse and even murder. It is a demonstrable fact that acts of invidious discrimination do exist in many levels of society. On the one hand, that shouldn't be surprising because as Christians we understand that the world is fallen and people are fallen and sinful behavior results from that. But on the other hand, as Christians called to be salt and light, we can personally and we can publicly effect change to minimize, to reduce, and in some ways eliminate the effects of the fall in these areas of life. For example, we engage in medicine to reduce suffering and to save lives. We engage in economic development to produce, for example, an abundance of food, to raise people from poverty. And we engage in the public square, including politics and law, so that we can be ruled by governments of law, not dictatorships of men. And my purpose today is to help us to think Christianly about acts of discrimination using the United States experiment to evaluate these kinds of things and to look at proposed legal remedies to them. I'm going to give you three perspectives. First, I want us to understand the important theological foundations. Second, I want to show how those foundations should inform justice and thereby shape the law and the public square. And thirdly, I want to assess some efforts showing that in many cases in the United States, despite good intentions with so-called non-discrimination laws, they create great wrongs. So let's begin with the theological considerations. Let's first focus on God and His character. Deuteronomy 10:17. For the Lord, your God, is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial. 2 Chronicles 19:7. Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be careful what you do, for there is no injustice with the Lord our God, or partiality. Job 34:19. God who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich more than the poor. Why? For they are all the work of his hands. Peter says in Acts chapter 10, truly I understand that God shows no partiality. Romans 2:11. For God shows no partiality. Galatians 2:6. God shows no partiality. Luke 20:21. So they asked him, Jesus, teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. God shows no partiality in his character. Secondly, what about justice? Private justice. Job 13:8. Ask a rhetorical question. Will you show partiality? The answer, of course, implied is no. Job 13:10. He will surely rebuke you if in secret you show partiality. Job 32:21. I will not show partiality to any man. Malachi 2:8. So I will make you despised and abased before all people. Why? Inasmuch as you do not keep my ways, but show partiality. 1 Timothy 5:21. I charge you to keep these rules without prejudging. Do nothing from partiality. James 2:1. My brothers, show no partiality. James 2:9. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin. And then we see this same theme extends not only to our private lives, but to the law and to the court system, publicly, law and policy. Exodus 23:3. Nor shall you be partial to the poor man in his lawsuit. Leviticus 19:15. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Deuteronomy 1:17. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. Deuteronomy 16:19. You shall not pervert justice. How? You shall not show partiality. Psalm 82:2. How long will you judge unjustly? How? And show partiality. Proverbs 18:5. It is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the righteousness of justice. Proverbs 24:23. Partiality in judging is not good. Proverbs 28:31. To show partiality is not good. And then Paul puts this whole point with respect to employment relationships. He says, masters or employers, do the same. Stop threatening those who work for you. There shall be no partiality because of who God is. Colossians 3:25, there shall be no partiality. I think it's clear then, because God is impartial, because God calls us to be impartial in all of our conduct, whether private or in the public sphere, and because to do otherwise perverts justice and fails to follow God's ways, we must therefore assess all legal anti-discrimination efforts through that particular lens. Sometimes they pass muster, other times they do not. Otherwise, in the hope or the pretext of doing some good, we can actually be doing harm, as the scripture says, perverting justice by codifying partiality. Good intentions done with the wrong means produce wrong ends. For example, if you do music, you know that if you play the right note at the wrong time, it does not produce beautiful music. And so our business must be about public justice, but public justice that is rightly configured, rightly ordered as to the proper means and ends. How does that work, and why should we do it? Writing in 1981, one commentator put it this way, again using starkly biblical and inescapably political and legal terminology. He said, Jesus Christ is Lord. That is the first and final assertion Christians make about all reality, including politics. Believers now assert by faith what will one day be manifest in the sight of all. Every earthly sovereignty, and by that he means states, nations, etc., is subordinate to the sovereignty of Jesus Christ. End quote. Politics and law per se cannot be dirty because Jesus himself holds a political and legal office. He is the Lord. Another scholar put it this way, the Christian faith is either relevant to all of life or it is relevant to none of it. The claims of God are either total or he is not God. To ask Christianity to stay in its own territory is to ask it to stay in all of life. And that would include a faithful presence in the public square dealing with law, policy, politics, and the human good. So then what would be the aim of this faithful presence if it's rightly ordered? What should be the trajectory of a rightly ordered political and legal power? What is the thematic direction, and what should the Christian propose to seek to influence law and public policy? Scholar Daniel Dreisbach describes this vector in the motif of a God-shaped and a gospel-shaped faithful presence in the political and legal sphere. He says, and I quote, "The cause of liberty is the cause of God. God favors and approves the cause of liberty, and tyranny and arbitrary rule are offensive to him. Indeed, a state of tyranny, of slavery, or sin represents a disordering of God's moral structure. Liberty, in short, is the most cherished possession of a free and civilized society." Well, then, how then should we act politically given this creational normative context? Scholar Douglas Farrell crystallizes this by noting, first of all, the impossibility of political or legal neutrality, that we actually have political and legal marching orders. He says, first, we must offer a potent and relentless critique of our society's habitual evasion of truth. What we need to point out to our fellow citizens is that man is not and cannot be philosophically or theologically neutral. Neither then can be our politics, and by implication, our laws. There is no presuppositionalist political sphere, no sphere in which nothing is directly implied about the nature of God or of man. There is no city or polis that has no determinate loves, that makes no commitments, that renders no firm judgment of good or evil, that knows God or not. This is an inescapable political implication of the Christian faith. The state does not address the church or the Christian citizen with an independent authority capable of overruling the law of God, whether we call that the natural law or as the law of Christ. The state performs a limited service both to God and to civil society and can lay claim only to a limited and derivative jurisdiction. And then he concludes, and this gets to the heart of what we want to consider. Are we really to suppose that the state functions best when it concerns itself as little as possible with what is actually right and wrong, actually good or evil, actually conducive to happiness or unhappiness? And by that he means human flourishing. Put differently, Christians cannot commend publicly that which God condemns scripturally if good and evil are to retain their functional and true meanings. To do otherwise perverts justice, even if well intended, because it can import wrongful partiality. Now, John Murray, the theologian, takes all these points and applies them to the very church, that is, that which stewards the gospel. He taught that it was, in fact, the church's role to speak into such circumstances, including using political and legal categories, because those categories express how moral convictions, Christian convictions, can be set forth, proposed, and applied in this public sphere. He says, when laws are proposed or enacted that are contrary to the Word of God, it is the duty of the church to proclaim and in official pronouncement to oppose and condemn them. It is this misconception of what is involved in the proclamation of the whole counsel of God to suppose or to plead that the church has no concern with the political sphere. The church is concerned with every sphere and is obligated to proclaim and to inculcate the revealed will of God as it bears upon every department of life. And so this context that I've just given you gives us a litmus test and a lens for correctly analyzing anti-discrimination and efforts to remediate anti-discrimination, how the law can both help and how it can hurt, particularly as it impacts religious freedom. In the United States today, there are many efforts to limit religious freedom under the guise of, quote, eliminating discrimination, largely driven by LGBTQ interests. And they target particular kinds of professions. For example, they target creative professionals, videographers, bakers, florists, calligraphers, T-shirt printers, and so forth. They also target mercy ministries like adoption agencies, homeless shelters, hospitals, private schools. Now, the rationales that you hear in Twitter and sound bites claim that promoting religious liberty is just a ruse, that it's, quote, a license to discriminate, quote, that it's the effort of, quote, hate groups, quote, that people who promote religious liberty are, quote, on the wrong side of history. Well, we need to assess these claims, and we need to assess the proposed means when they are targeting these kinds of things. For example, we need to recognize that there are differences between things, between one thing and different things. On the one hand, being rational and making decisions, including rational disagreement or even dissent, that's one thing. On the other hand, there is unjust acts and unjust treatment of real people. And in fact, the state should restrict those sorts of things. But that's where we have to analyze it. Put differently, not every decision based on a distinction or a disagreement comprises a wrongful act of invidious discrimination. Let me give you some examples. What if you have a truck hauling company or a shipping company that refuses to hire blind people to drive or pilot a ship? Well, that's not discrimination against handicapped persons. What if you have a professional basketball team that refuses to hire a short and unskilled or even a paralyzed person for their team? That's not wrongful discrimination against a short, handicapped person. What if a TV production studio refuses to hire a black woman to portray President Bill Clinton in a biographical film? Well, that's not wrongful discrimination against women or against black persons. What if parents give money to support their own children and refuse to give money to strangers who identify as LGBTQ? Well, that's not wrongful discrimination against people who identify as LGBTQ. What if you refuse to hire a white person to teach Korean, and that person doesn't teach Korean, and you can make up whatever category it is. The point here is the person, whether white, black, yellow, red, whatever color you like, it's not wrongful discrimination because the person doesn't know Korean, so they certainly can't teach it. Well, what we're seeing in the United States is under the guise of what's called affirmative action, many universities, very top-level universities, have schemes that systematically exclude particularly Asians. There's an ongoing lawsuit now against Harvard, which has discriminated against Asian admissions, and the Justice Department of the United States is now investigating Yale University for the same kind of scheme to systematically exclude and target Asians. We see in California Senate Bill 826, which requires publicly held, publicly traded corporations to have at least one woman on the governing board of directors. There's no rationale for that. It's just kind of a quota-like system. Well, how do we evaluate these kinds of things? And there are many more. Well, we need to understand that good intentions can, in fact, pervert justice, to use the biblical terminology, by showing wrongful partiality contrary to God's law. How? How can we discern these things? What are the clues? What are the indicia? Well, on the one hand, some of these schemes always look to the past to propose some sort of remediation or reparation, instead of having the law clear away obstacles for disadvantaged people, focusing on the future for opportunity. A lot of these schemes will focus on outcomes rather than opportunities. And I believe when they do that, that's going to be a form of wrongful partiality. So we see quota schemes, we see partiality in evaluations of applicants for various things, whether that be education or for preferable loans. And so we see the law picking winners and losers when it shouldn't do that. It should instead create a structure that is fairness and opportunity for all on equal terms. Another way these schemes do this is by employing what I call unbiblical taxonomy, which is typically informed by identity politics, critical theory, critical race theory, cultural Marxism, which conflicts at many levels with a true Christian worldview. For example, treating people only as a member of a group, as a tribe or a clan, not as individuals looking at what they bring to the table or the application. Or they go farther and say, we are going to assert an identity solely based on socially constructed matters, not rooted in reality. This is the concept called intersectionality. We won't go into that, but just be aware of it. But the Christian worldview pushes back on this in at least four ways. First, the Christian worldview affirms and assumes a universal human nature that does not vary as to time, geography, ethnicity, coloration. It's not a fluid construct. We each have a universal human nature. Number two, the Christian worldview assumes and affirms a sexed anthropology consisting of male and female, and that anthropology is immutable, as opposed to what we hear with gender ideology. Third, the Christian worldview valorizes the individual as an individual, not as a tribe, not as a clan, nor as a part of some supposedly oppressed group. And fourthly, the Christian worldview looks at behavior as being morally culpable, not a status. And so we need to evaluate particularized behaviors, not simply the status or an inclusion in a group or not. So what do we see then? We see a targeting of supposed harms. Now, some of these harms are real, but a lot of them are not, of modern anti-discrimination efforts. For example, economic harms. Not just creating opportunities, as I alluded to, but actual remediation and reparations for the past, rather than freedom for the future. This could be involved in preferential hiring, in handouts of government welfare and things, preferential loans, preferential favors. All these kinds of things engage in some form of partiality, and so they're suspect. We also see now a new kind of claim in the last decade or so called dignitary harms. The idea here is that there are certain harms when people make a distinction that you can't make that distinction because that makes people feel bad. And so we're seeing laws now mandating public respect and recognition. It's a new sort of creed or orthodoxy. What's important to recognize is that dignitary harm cannot be objectively assessed or evaluated. It's purely subjective. This is the notion of the cancel culture, trigger warnings, and so forth. We also see from the literature that people advancing these things are not just looking at particular perceived harms, but want to actually change the entire social structure. They claim that there is systemic discrimination in all the structures of the United States. And so what they tell us is, and I'm quoting here, one goal is cultural transformation. Another person says it is part of a project of social reconstruction. Its aim is to reshape beliefs and values. Well, that is a problem, I think, when the state is engaging in it. We call it what? Propaganda. And the translator will have the citations to those. So, now how do they do that? How do they then take these ideas, this idea to rearrange culture, to restructure our beliefs and values? Well, they attach it to employment matters in the United States. That's something called Title VII. They attach it to housing matters and that sort of thing. What happens is you have an overly broad solution here. There's legitimate issues in employment and legitimate issues in housing, but when you go overly broad, that is wrongful partiality. But the key area of action today is what's called a public accommodation. Businesses open to the public. In the United States, this stems from that horrific national sin called chattel slavery. As you may know, the United States actually had slavery for many years, and they fought a bloody civil war to end it. So in 1875, after the war was concluded, the notion of public accommodations were opened legally so that people, black and white, could have equal access to them. So, inns and hotels, trains, boats, and theaters. And that continued, though there was a backwash in the southern part of the United States, which was evil, that tried to prevent that and created these schemes of separate but equal and so forth. But in 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the notion of public accommodations continued and expanded to areas of hotels, restaurants, theaters, fuel stations, gas stations, and stadiums, anything open to the public in those categories. But today, what's happened is the left has captured this idea, and now that anything that involves any public transaction may be subject to this public accommodation idea. And it's usually tethered to various protected classes. Now, these classes deal with partiality. Sometimes that's fine and good, depending on how it's used and which category. The question is it rooted in reality and metaphysics and not just some favored group? So, in 1875, going back, the idea was to present an openness for future opportunity on equal footing. And so the categories were race or color to involved in this. That's perfectly legitimate and was necessary. 1964, they expanded that a bit, race, color, national origin, and religion, to say, look, we can't really discriminate on those bases in public accommodation. The fact that someone wears a yarmulke and goes to Starbucks and asks for coffee, you can't turn them away because they're wearing a yarmulke. Those kinds of things. So that made a lot of sense. But today what we have is a push to accelerate and expand these various categories, and they're not inherent or metaphysical or tethered to foundational beliefs like religion. So we see things like religion, color, national origin. Okay, that's fine. Age, it gets a little blurry there. Disability, well, it depends on who defines that. Marital status can be very problematic for a church. Maybe your church doesn't want to have members that are in a same-sex marriage. Oh, but you're a public accommodation. And now we have all kinds of categories such as source of income, one's arrest record, physical appearance, sexual orientation, gender identity, political beliefs, familial status, whether you're a student or not, domestic partner, receipt of rental assistance, refusal to disclose Social Security numbers, those kinds of. So you just make these things up, and they're not really dealing with historically oppressed situations. You're just kind of trying to favor, to be partial to other groups. Now, this creates clashes and tensions. For example, 20 years ago, we had a situation where a group for young men called the Boy Scouts, a voluntary association, had a rule that says we're not going to allow LGBT people to be leaders of the Boy Scouts. And that was litigated. It was claimed that was discrimination against the LGBT Scoutmaster leader. But the Boy Scouts said, we don't want someone who has those kinds of attractions to be in tents in the wilderness with young boys. And they won that case in the year 2000, saying there's an associational right. That's not discrimination, that's an associational right. We saw this, of course, go the other way 15 years later in the Obergefell decision, which federalized, constitutionalized same-sex marriage, which then creates a lot of religious liberty issues in the last 5 years, and we'll talk about that. And most recently in 2020, we had the Supreme Court rule that the public accommodation provision of Title VII dealing with employment, it's not public accommodation, but it's the employment aspect of it, included sexual orientation and gender ideology, even though those things are not in the actual text. So what we have to ask is there actual discriminatory acts involved, actual injustice, or is it just someone's saying their feelings are hurt because they claim to be part of a group? And then we have to ask, is the solution biblical or unbiblical in terms of how it shows partiality? Remember that merely disagreeing is not the same as an invidious discriminatory act. Is the focus on the person or on what they've been asked to do? Is it on the message or the status? Is it on a class or is it on celebrating an event? Let me see if I can flesh this out, talking about some of our clients. So, Jack Phillips is a cake artist. He serves everybody that comes into his shop, but he doesn't agree with all messages. And he has been the target of no less than 3 lawsuits, winning 2 of them already, and he's still in the 3rd, where an LGBT couple wanted him to create a special artistic cake for their same-sex ceremony. He refused. He said, I'll sell you anything in my shop, but I can't embrace that message because I'm a Christian, so on and so forth. Or Baronelle Stutzman, who's a floral artist. She served this particular person many times over many, many years, including providing valentines and these kinds of things, but not with respect to a same-sex marriage. And she has been sued and sued and sued, and we're fighting that. It's a religious liberty, sort of that claim. Or Blaine Adamson. Blaine Adamson is a client that produces custom-made T-shirts. He was asked to create a message that affirmed LGBT pride for a pride parade. He said, I can't do that. That's the message I will not do. I will refer you out. You'll get a great T-shirt at the same price or a lower price. And they did, but they still sued him. Now, thankfully, he won at the highest court in the state of Kentucky. Or our clients here in where I am in Arizona, Brush and Nib, they are custom calligraphers, and they will do all kinds of things, but they simply will not do messages for marriages that celebrate same-sex ceremonies. And there's other messages as well. They will not convey, Satanist messages and that sort of thing. They actually won a great decision at the Arizona Supreme Court that we were able to litigate. We have our friends in Minnesota, Telescope Media, and they are custom creative filmmakers. They do weddings, they do custom other kinds of things. They're videographers. And they actually won a great decision at the 8th Circuit after going out on the offensive and saying, look, we need to see what this looks like. We are going to use our artistic, but we're not going to convey messages with which we disagree. We see up in Alaska, Sherry Laurie, our client, is the executive director of a battered woman's abuse shelter. One night, a drunken man came to this center. He's has gender dysphoria. He claims to be a woman. He's certainly not. He was drunk, he was beat up, and he wanted to spend the night with these women who had been physically and sexually abused. Sherry gave him a ride through a taxi service, got him some medical help and those sorts of things. He still sued her, but I'm pleased to say that our team did well and vindicated him. Or consider Dr. Schwartz, who's an Orthodox Jew. He's a psychiatrist. He practices talk therapy. He had adult men come to him, not boys, adult men come to him that struggle with same-sex attraction. He talks to them about this and tries to, consistent with his Jewish faith and his psychiatry, to lessen that through talk therapy, through counseling. He was threatened with criminal sanctions for doing nothing more than talking with his clients. We're grateful that when we pushed on that and pushed back, his religious liberty was in fact preserved, and they changed the rule. So we also have a young student at a university who, on a private Twitter feed, said he is opposed to all forms of racial discrimination, but he believes that the blacklivesmatter.com group is really contrary to Christianity if you look at their website. He was expelled from being the president of his university's senate, but thanks be to God, we got that turned around at the school senate, and we're continuing there. So, what do we then see today? Well, depending upon who holds the White House and all that sort of thing, there's an act that's been passed but not made law yet. It's been passed by the Senate, I should say by the House of Representatives in the United States. It's called the Equality Act. Now, who could be opposed to the Equality Act? Well, don't go by the title. Look at what it actually does. What that does is it federalizes all public accommodations, extending coverage to the entire menagerie of LGBTQ plus categories as to public accommodations. But it's very harmful and very dangerous and very damaging because the Equality Act contains no religious exemptions for conscience and religious liberty. Moreover, the Equality Act would suppress and negate what's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed many decades ago, almost unanimously, which provides for preservation. So this act would gut religious liberty so that you only believe in your head, but you can't live your faith. There's another act that's out there, and it's unfortunately gotten some traction with a lot of Christians. It's called Fairness for All. Well, who would be opposed to Fairness for All? But it's interesting, that act is rejected by LGBTQ as not going far enough, but it's also not very good. It doesn't provide fairness for all. It's problematic. So if you hear something like this, Fairness for All, or what's called the Utah Compromise, you need to be very careful with that, and I would suggest you reject it because it fails to cover many Christians. Doesn't cover all Christians. And it fails to cover other individuals for their rights of conscience, individuals that the Bible says are our neighbors. They're also made in the very image and likeness of God. They also have natural rights, and they ought not to be censored or coerced, and that's what this law would permit. Second of all, this Fairness for All claims that the trans issue, gender dysphoria, is a civil rights issue rather than a psychological matter. And that's not a Christian position. Third, Fairness for All fails to protect shelters, for example, of abused women. Sherry Laurie would have had to allow this man to spend the night with these abused and sexually assaulted women. Fourth, it would probably impose the use of preferred personal pronouns, which is not a good thing because pronouns refer to reality. You can't speak that which is inaccurate or a lie. So that's not right. Fifth, it enshrines attractions and behaviors by rejecting Christian ethics, saying that a same-sex attraction, for example, is okay to have and legally protect. Well, that's not really the Christian worldview. So where does this leave us? How do we go forward? Let me give you a few suggestions in closing. First, love the Lord your God with all your being, heart, soul, strength, and mind. Cultivate that mind that can discern these things. Second of all, understand that this true and living God is not partial, and he calls us to impartiality in both attitude and in action. Third, our prime directive is to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, which summarizes the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount. We're to be light and salt, and Jesus says that is to be evident in our good works before men. And those good works are to be consistent and ethical in alignment with the very way of God, the very law of God. Fourth, only then can we rightly love our neighbor consistent with these precepts, including how we engage in law and public policy, including, therefore, eradicating unjust discriminatory acts. Thus, we must oppose invidious discrimination and invidious discriminatory acts, but we must understand it how God defines it and seek to establish justice as God defines it. Psalm 18 tells us that God trains our hands for war. Now, why would he do that? He's not talking about, bazookas and missiles. It's a little bit different than that. Well, I think the answer lies in Isaiah 59. The prophet says, "Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away, for truth has stumbled in the public squares." Truth is lacking. The Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Do you see the picture? Truth is supposed to be public. It's supposed to be evident. It's supposed to be strong. It's supposed to be stable. And instead it's teetering. It's tottering. It's wobbling. It's falling apart. And this displeases God. But then God wonders, there's no one to intercede. There's no one to stabilize justice in the public square. And he's essentially saying, where are you? It's up to the Christians called to be that steadier of stumbled truth. And that's who we need to be. That's the problem. There was no one to intercede, to remedy injustice, either in effect or in a proposed solution, like certain anti-discrimination laws that target religious expression, religious liberty. Both are aspects of injustice, and both are called for attention by us as Christians. See, God trains us to intercede as fellow workers for the truth, as 3 John 8 says. We are to be fellow workers for the truth, because truth has stumbled. That stumbled truth must be steadied. That is our task. And it's no different when we're dealing with the anti-discrimination regime that's trying to stifle, stunt, and change the very way that we think about these things. May God be true, though all men are liars. I want to give thanks to the translator who did this, a friend of mine, and then I will simply leave you with this. 감사합니다.